Layla was drugged and forcibly hospitalized by her grandson, who wanted to take her fortune. But what she did after revealing her secret was surprising and left the grandson paralyzed with rage and fear. Mrs. Layla was an 80-year-old lady, known by everyone in the neighborhood as a generous and cheerful woman. She lived in a large house, inherited from a life of hard work and good decisions. Her only grandson, Michael, had lived with her since he was little, and she always did everything to ensure he had a comfortable life. She cared for him with much love, offering him the best of everything, as he was the only family she had left. In recent months, Mrs. Layla began to notice something different about Michael. He, who was always attentive and present, now spent more time on the phone, in mysterious conversations at parties, with questionable friends, and seemed distant, always with a cold look. When she tried to talk, he responded quickly and impatiently, which was not normal. "Michael, my dear, are you all right? You seem so worried lately," she would ask, but he always changed the subject, saying everything was fine, but that he needed more money, only talking about luxury and using his grandmother for some personal gain. Mrs. Layla, despite loving and trusting her grandson, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She started observing him more closely, paying attention to every detail of his behavior, but without saying anything. In her heart, doubt grew. What was happening to the boy she loved so much and had raised with such care? Michael, increasingly obsessed with Mrs. Layla's fortune, began to see his grandmother as an obstacle to his desires. He knew she had a large amount of money saved, as well as valuable properties, and the idea of inheriting it all and spending it as he pleased was constantly on his mind. However, waiting for it all to happen naturally seemed too slow for him. Greed consumed him, and he decided he needed to act. One night, while they were having dinner together, Michael suggested that Mrs. Layla was getting too old to manage everything on her own. "Gran, you've worked so hard in life. I think it would be better if you started delegating some responsibilities. Avoid unnecessary worries. Maybe you should let me take care of your documents and bank accounts," he suggested, trying to sound concerned and caring. Mrs. Layla, however, was suspicious of his tone. "But, my dear, I've always managed everything so well. Why would I let you do it now?" she replied, with a slight hint of suspicion in her voice. Michael didn't give up. He started visiting lawyers, seeking information on how he could take legal control of his grandmother's assets. At home, he insisted on helping with the finances, offering to take care of the bills and important decisions. "You don't need to worry about anything, Gran. Let me handle everything for you," he would say, trying to convince her. But Mrs. Layla, with the wisdom of her years, felt that something wasn't right. "I appreciate it, Michael, but I think I can still handle it," she would reply, always kind but firm. But Michael was determined. He began researching ways to make his grandmother appear incapable of managing her own assets, further fueling his ambition. The money and properties that he once saw as a distant future now became an obsession. "She doesn't need this anymore. She's lived long enough. I'm the heir. I deserve this good life now," he thought, not caring about how Mrs. Layla might feel. Greed transformed the grandson she loved so much, and Michael no longer saw his grandmother as the woman who raised him, but merely as a barrier between him and the fortune he so desperately wanted. Michael, determined to carry out his plan, began to implement a more subtle strategy. He knew he needed to weaken Mrs. Layla's resistance, and for that, he decided to use medication. One day, during breakfast, he appeared with a bottle of pills in hand. "Gran, these are new vitamins that the doctor recommended for you. They'll help you stay strong and keep your mind sharp," he said, with a forced smile, pushing the pills towards her. Mrs. Layla looked at the pills with a doubtful expression. "But Michael, I've never needed so many vitamins before. And who is this doctor you consulted? I don't even remember talking to him," she remarked, picking up the bottle and examining the pills, which looked ordinary. Michael, noticing his grandmother's suspicion, adopted a softer, almost childlike tone to convince her. "Gran, it's just to make sure you stay well without having to worry. I only want what's best for you, and the doctor said these will make you feel even better," he insisted, gently placing one of the pills in her hand. Mrs. Layla, still uncertain, eventually gave in to the affection she had always had for her grandson. "All right, Michael, I'll trust you," she said, putting the pill in her mouth and swallowing it with a sip of water, though the doubt still lingered in her mind. As the days passed, Mrs. Layla began to notice that she felt different. Her mind, once so clear and active, started to become confused at random moments. She forgot small things, like where she left her keys or what she had planned for the day. "Michael, I think these pills are making me feel strange. I don't feel as well as you said I would," she commented one morning, struggling to remember something important she had forgotten. Michael, remaining calm, tried to reassure her. "It's normal at first, Gran. Your body is adjusting. Soon you'll feel great, you'll see," he assured her, while helping her sit on the sofa. But inside, he knew the pills were doing exactly what he wanted, weakening his grandmother, both physically and mentally. With each passing day, Mrs. Layla became more dependent on Michael, who continued to give her the pills, always hiding the truth behind a smile and sweet words. "Trust me, Gran. I'm here to take care of you," he repeated. Michael, realizing that Mrs. Layla was becoming increasingly confused because of the pills he had been giving her, decided it was the right time to take the next step in his plan. One day, he made a call to a doctor he knew, someone who wouldn't question his intentions too much. "Doctor, my grandmother has been acting very strangely. She's forgetting things, becoming disoriented. I think it might be dementia," he said, trying to sound worried and sincere. The doctor, trusting Michael and unaware of what was really happening, agreed to make a visit. When the doctor arrived, Mrs. Layla was sitting in her armchair trying to read a book, but with her eyes lost in the words. Michael quickly began to explain the situation, painting a grim picture. "Doctor, she's been getting confused with simple things, forgetting who I am, sometimes not even recognizing her own house. I'm really worried," he said, with a fabricated expression of sadness. The doctor, seeing the confusion in Mrs. Layla's eyes and hearing the words of her grandson, began to ask some questions. "Mrs. Layla, do you know what day it is today? Can you tell me where we are?" he asked, trying to assess the situation. But Mrs. Layla, with her mind clouded by the pills, hesitated in her response. I think it's Wednesday? Or is it Tuesday? Sorry, doctor, I'm a bit tired," she said, frustrated by her difficulty in remembering. Michael seized the opportunity to reinforce his lies. "You see, doctor, this happens all the time. She can't remember the most basic things," he stated, with a voice that feigned concern, but inside he felt victorious. After a few minutes of observation and questions, the doctor, without considering the possibility that Mrs. Layla was being poisoned, reached a conclusion. "Michael, it seems your grandmother is indeed showing signs of dementia. It's a sad situation, but common in people her age. We need to think about measures to ensure she's safe and well cared for," said the doctor in a serious tone. Mrs. Layla, hearing those words, felt a tightness in her chest. "Dementia? I don't think I'm going mad," she murmured, her eyes welling up with tears, feeling more lost than ever. But Michael, keeping up the facade of the good grandson, approached and held her hand. "Don't worry, Gran, I'll take care of everything. I'll do what's best for you," he said, hiding the relief he felt seeing his plan working perfectly. As the doctor wrote down his recommendations, Michael knew he had taken a big step towards gaining control of his grandmother's assets. He was already beginning to imagine the future, without her presence to hinder his plans. Everything was going exactly as he had planned. After the doctor's diagnosis, Michael decided it was time to put the final part of his plan into action. He knew that to gain full control of Mrs. Layla's assets, he would need to remove her from the house and let her bills accumulate, proving that she could no longer manage and that someone else should take over. So on a rainy morning, without warning, he called an ambulance and a few nurses to take his grandmother to a care home. When the nurses arrived, Mrs. Layla was in the living room trying to remember where she had left her glasses. Seeing the men in white entering the house, she felt a chill down her spine. "Michael, what's happening? Who are these people?" she asked, her voice trembling as she held onto her grandson's arm, seeking answers. Michael, with a forced expression of calm, replied softly, "Gran, it's for your own good. The doctor said you need special care. I found a place where they'll take very good care of you, where you'll have company and attention all the time." Realizing what was happening, Mrs. Layla tried to resist, "But Michael, I don't want to go. This is my home. It always has been. I'm fine here. Please, my dear, listen to me," she pleaded, tears in her eyes, hoping he would understand. But Michael had already made up his mind. "Gran, I've already decided it's for your own good. You can't stay here alone anymore. Please, trust me," he said, as the nurses, with a mix of gentleness and firmness, began guiding her out of the house. Mrs. Layla tried to hold on to anything she could, but it was in vain. She felt weak, powerless, being taken away against her will. On the way out, she looked at Michael, still hoping he would change his mind. "Michael, please, don't leave me there. I always took care of you. Don't do this to me," she begged, her voice breaking with pain. But Michael, with a cold and distant look, simply responded, "Gran, this is for the best. It'll be better for both of us." When they arrived at the care home, Mrs. Layla was met by nurses who tried to reassure her, but the panic and sadness in her heart were overwhelming. As she was led to her room, she took one last look at Michael, who was talking to a nurse, already planning the next step to get the documents that would make him the owner of everything that belonged to her. Sitting on the bed in the unfamiliar room, Mrs. Layla felt the weight of loneliness and betrayal. She had always believed that Michael loved her, that he would be her companion until the end. But now, there, in that strange bed, all that remained was a deep sense of loss and the bitter memory of being torn from her own home by the only grandson she had loved so much. Life in the care home seemed like an endless nightmare for Mrs. Layla. The days were long, and the longing for home weighed heavily on her heart. She spent hours staring out the window of her room, imagining what it would be like to return to the place where she had lived for so many years. The nights were the worst. She felt lost, alone, and tears became her silent companions. But over time, Mrs. Layla began to realize that the care home wasn't as terrible as she had imagined. The nurses, always kind, treated her with respect and care. One of them, a young woman named Anna, who had spoken extensively with Michael on the day of Layla's arrival, stood out for her kindness and patience. Anna had a warm smile that brightened Mrs. Layla's darkest days. "Good morning, Mrs. Layla. How are you feeling today? Your grandson left me responsible for looking after you," Anna would ask in the early mornings, her voice sweet. At first, Mrs. Layla would respond with just a nod or a murmur, still consumed by sadness and a mind muddled by the medication. But gradually, Anna's constant presence and gentle manner began to break down the barriers that fear had built. I'm better, dear. Thank you for asking," Mrs. Layla said one day, surprised to realize that her response came with a small smile. Besides Anna, Mrs. Layla also started to get to know the other residents of the care home. There was Mr. John, who loved to tell stories from his youth, Mrs. Mary, who spent her afternoons knitting and always had a kind word, and Mr. Paul, who, despite having difficulty walking, insisted on helping however he could. At first, Mrs. Layla observed them from a distance, still withdrawn, but over time she began to join the conversations, laugh at Mr. John's jokes, and take an interest in Mrs. Mary's crafts. One afternoon, while watching Anna help Mr. Paul walk through the garden, Mrs. Layla felt a spark of hope. "Anna, how do you manage to be so patient and caring with all of us? It must be difficult," she asked with genuine curiosity. Anna, still holding Mr. Paul's arm, looked at Mrs. Layla with a smile. "You know, Mrs. Layla, I learn a lot from all of you. Each of you has an incredible story, and I feel like, in some way, we're all taking care of each other. That makes it all worthwhile," she replied simply. These words touched Mrs. Layla's heart. She began to realize that despite being far from home, she had found a new one, where friendship and mutual care made life lighter. The sadness still came sometimes, but now she knew she wasn't alone. Gradually, Mrs. Layla started to adapt, finding comfort in the small routines, the conversations in the garden, and above all, the sincere friendship that was blossoming between her and Anna. With each passing day at the care home, Mrs. Layla and Anna grew closer. Anna was attentive in a special way, always paying attention to the little things that made Mrs. Layla feel comfortable. They talked about everything, from the flowers in the garden to Mrs. Layla's memories of her youth. In one of these conversations, Anna began to realize that the lady in front of her was not just any elderly woman, but someone with a sharp mind and a heart full of stories. One afternoon, while they were having tea on the veranda, Anna mentioned a problem she was having at home with her finances. You know, Mrs. Layla, I always get tangled up with the bills at the end of the month. I wish I could learn to organize it better, but I've never been good with numbers, Anna confessed, a little embarrassed. Mrs. Layla, who had been quiet until then, looked at her with interest. Dear, did you know that I was responsible for managing my family's business for years? I could help you with that if you'd like, she said, with a sparkle in her eyes that Anna hadn't seen before. Surprised, Anna accepted the offer, and the next day she brought her bills for Mrs. Layla to look over. The elderly woman analyzed everything with impressive ease, explaining to Anna how to organize the payments and even suggesting some ways to save money. You have to think of it like a puzzle. Every piece has its place, and when everything is in the right place, the final picture makes sense, Mrs. Layla said with a satisfied smile, while Anna listened attentively. It was at that moment that Anna realized Mrs. Layla was much more lucid and capable than others thought. The image of a frail lady, struggling to remember things, began to fade. What Anna saw now was an intelligent woman, with a vast life experience, and above all, someone with a big heart. Mrs. Layla, you're amazing. I never imagined you were so good with these things, Anna said admiringly as she put away the organized papers. You should talk more about this with the others. They need to know you still have so much to offer. Mrs. Layla smiled, a smile of gratitude but also of sadness. You know, dear, after everything that happened, it's hard. Michael made me doubt myself so much, but you've made me feel useful again, and that's something I thought I had lost, she confessed, her voice heavy with emotion. Anna, touched by those words, gently held Mrs. Layla's hand. Mrs. Layla, you are much more than what happened, and I'm here to remind you of that every day, she promised, with a firm and sincere look. From that moment on, Anna began to spend more time with Mrs. Layla, not just as a caregiver, but as a friend, learning more and more from the wisdom and strength of the woman who was gradually regaining confidence in herself. And Mrs. Layla, in turn, found in Anna a true support, someone who saw beyond the frail appearance and recognized the value of the woman she had always been. Mrs. Layla, who used to keep her pains and secrets to herself, began to open up to Anna in a way she didn't with anyone else. On a sunny afternoon, as they strolled through the garden of the care home, Anna noticed that Mrs. Layla seemed thoughtful, with a distant look. Mrs. Layla, what's on your mind? You seem worried, she asked, concerned for her friend's well-being. Mrs. Layla smiled slightly, but there was a shadow of sadness in her eyes. Oh, Anna, sometimes I find myself thinking about everything I've lived through. So much time has passed, so many things have happened. Sometimes it feels like it was all a dream, she said, looking at the horizon, as if trying to see the past. Anna, sensing the melancholy in Mrs. Layla's voice, gently squeezed her hand. If you want, you can tell me more about those memories. I'd love to hear your stories, she suggested, with a caring tone, knowing that sharing could lighten the burden Mrs. Layla carried. Touched by Anna's sincerity, Mrs. Layla felt she could truly trust her. So she began to talk about her youth, the struggles she faced in building her family's wealth, and how, over the years, she learned to deal with life's losses and challenges. She spoke about her husband, who had been the love of her life, and how she missed him every day. He was my rock, you know. When he was gone, I thought I wouldn't be able to go on. But I did. I had to be strong for Michael, she said, her eyes welling up with tears but maintaining the dignity of someone who had lived a lot. Anna listened to every word attentively, admiring even more the strength of the woman who, despite so many battles, could still speak with so much love and wisdom. Mrs. Layla, you're an inspiration. Your story. It makes me think about how life is about overcoming, about moving forward even when everything seems difficult, Anna said, moved by what she heard. Over time, Mrs. Layla began to feel lighter, as if by sharing her memories, she was lightening the burden she carried. Anna, my dear, you've brought light into my days. Sometimes I think of you as a daughter, Mrs. Layla confessed in a moment of vulnerability, letting her affection for Anna show. Anna, in turn, felt honored by Mrs. Layla's words. And you're like a mother to me. I learn so much from you, and I'm thankful every day for having met you, she replied, her voice choked with emotion. One night, as Mrs. Layla and Anna chatted quietly in the room, something felt different. The elderly lady, usually calm, seemed restless, as if she had something caught in her throat. Anna noticed the change and, concerned, asked, "Mrs. Layla, what's bothering you? I can tell you're more thoughtful today. Did something happen?" Mrs. Layla took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. Finally, she decided to open her heart to Anna, feeling she could no longer keep it to herself. "Anna, I can't stay silent any longer. I need to tell you something that's been tormenting me for days," she began, looking into Anna's eyes with a seriousness that Anna wasn't used to seeing. "I've always trusted Michael, always thought he would take care of me like I took care of him. But now I'm not so sure." Anna frowned, not fully understanding but ready to listen to whatever Mrs. Layla had to say. "What do you mean, Mrs. Layla? What are you trying to say?" she asked, feeling a pang of worry grow in her chest. Mrs. Layla grasped Anna's hand, as if needing strength to continue. "Anna, I think Michael brought me here for a reason, a terrible reason. He wants to take everything that's mine, the money, the properties. He made me seem incapable, filled me with pills that left me confused. I suspect he was trying to push me aside to gain control of everything," she revealed, with a voice full of sadness but also determination. Hannah was shocked by the revelation, but also by the courage Mrs. Layla was showing by speaking out about it. "But Mrs. Layla, what can we do? We can't let him keep doing this. You're right, we need to act," Anna said, already thinking of ways to help. Mrs. Layla squeezed Anna's hand, stronger now, with a determined expression on her face. "I need to protect what's mine, and you're the only person I trust to help me. I can't let Michael get what he wants. I want to transfer everything to someone else, someone I know will take care of it all with love and responsibility. I've thought about it a lot, and I've decided that person is you, Anna," she said, looking deeply into Anna's eyes. Anna was speechless, completely surprised by the trust Mrs. Layla was placing in her. "Mrs. Layla, I don't know what to say. It's so much. Are you sure? I'll do everything I can to help, but it's a huge responsibility," she replied, her voice choked with emotion, feeling the weight of the decision. Mrs. Layla smiled, a sad smile but full of certainty. "Anna, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know I can trust you. Only you can help me protect what I've spent my entire life building. We need to act quickly before Michael realizes what we're doing," she explained, her voice firm, as if she were preparing for a battle. Anna agreed, feeling the seriousness of the moment. "Mrs. Layla, I'll help you. We'll do whatever it takes to make sure everything stays safe and that Michael doesn't carry out this terrible plan. You can count on me with all my heart," she promised, feeling determined to protect Mrs. Layla, just as she had protected her family for so many years. With this alliance formed, both knew time was short and that they would need to be careful. But together, they were ready to face whatever came their way, united by trust and the will to do what was right. In the days following the revealing conversation, Mrs. Layla and Anna began to plan in secret. Mrs. Layla knew she had to act quickly before Michael noticed anything suspicious. She contacted a trusted lawyer, someone who had managed her affairs for many years, and arranged a discreet meeting. On a quiet morning, while everyone at the care home was still asleep, Mrs. Layla and Anna quietly left to meet the lawyer. In his office, the lawyer, a serious and experienced man, listened attentively to Mrs. Layla's plan. "Mrs. Layla, are you absolutely sure about this decision? Transferring everything is a big step," he asked, wanting to ensure she was aware of what she was about to do. Mrs. Layla, with a firm voice, responded without hesitation. "I am, Dr. Jones. I trust Anna completely. She's the only person who has truly helped me, who cares for me for who I am, not for what I have. I want her to have everything, and to take care of my legacy with the care only she can provide," she said, looking at Anna with deep gratitude. Anna, who was sitting beside Mrs. Layla, was visibly moved. She had never imagined that someone could trust her in this way, much less with something so significant. "Mrs. Layla, I don't know what to say. This is much more than I ever dreamed of. I promise I'll honor this trust. I'll take care of everything as if it were my own, because now it's also a part of your life that's with me," she said, tears in her eyes, holding Mrs. Layla's hand tightly. The lawyer, realizing the seriousness of the decision, began preparing the necessary documents. The hours passed slowly, but finally, everything was ready. Mrs. Layla signed each paper calmly, knowing she was doing the right thing, even though her heart was heavy with the situation. When the last document was signed, Mrs. Layla handed everything over to Anna, along with the house and all the information about her properties and accounts. "Anna, it's all yours now. Take good care, not just of the assets, but of the memories and stories they carry. I know you'll do it with the same love you've shown me," said Mrs. Layla, her voice soft but full of emotion. Anna, still emotional, looked at Mrs. Layla and promised with a heart full of gratitude, "I will, Mrs. Layla. I'll take care of everything with all the care and respect you deserve. I'll never forget what you've done for me, and I'll honor your trust every day of my life." With the transfer completed, the two returned to the care home, knowing they had taken an important step to protect what was most precious to Mrs. Layla. And as they re-entered that place, which now seemed a bit more welcoming, Mrs. Layla felt a sense of relief, knowing that whatever happened, what she had built with so much effort would be in good hands. A few days after the transfer of assets, Mrs. Layla felt there was still something important to share with Anna. It was a secret she had kept for many years, something even Michael didn't know, and that now, given the circumstances, needed to be revealed. On a calm afternoon, as the two talked in the garden of the care home, Mrs. Layla called Anna closer. "Anna, there's something I need to tell you, something I've kept secret for a long time. You deserve to know because now everything is in your hands," she began, looking around to make sure they were alone. Anna, noticing the serious tone in Mrs. Layla's voice, became curious and a little apprehensive. "What is it, Mrs. Layla? You can trust me, no matter what it is," she replied, holding her friend's hand for support. Mrs. Layla took a deep breath before continuing. "Many years ago, my husband and I invested in some works of art. They were rare pieces by renowned artists, which over time became even more valuable. Since we were always discreet, we never displayed these works publicly, and we decided to store them in a safe hiding place in our house," she revealed, with a nostalgic expression as she recalled the past. Anna was surprised by the revelation. "Works of art, Mrs. Layla, that's incredible. But where are these pieces now? Does anyone else know about this hiding place?" she asked, intrigued and at the same time concerned about the safety of this treasure. Mrs. Layla shook her head slowly. "No, no one else knows. Not even Michael. Everything is hidden in the basement, behind a false wall. The access is discreet, and we always took great care so that no one would suspect. The works are there, waiting for someone who knows how to appreciate and care for them as we did," she explained, with a slight smile, proud of having kept the secret for so long. Anna listened carefully and understood the responsibility that Mrs. Layla was entrusting to her. "Mrs. Layla, I promise I'll take care of these works as if they were a part of you and your husband. I'll make sure they stay safe and that the legacy you've built remains intact," Anna said, moved by the even greater trust Mrs. Layla was placing in her. Mrs. Layla, relieved to finally share this secret, felt more at peace. "I know I can trust you, Anna. Only you understand how much this means to me. Take care of the works, but also take care of the memories they represent. They are an important part of my story, and now they're part of yours too," she said, squeezing Anna's hand with gratitude. Anna smiled, feeling the weight and honor of this new responsibility. "Don't worry, Mrs. Layla. I'll protect these works and everything they represent with all the care you deserve," she replied, her voice full of determination. With this secret shared, Mrs. Layla felt she had finally put everything in order. She knew that whatever happened, her works of art, just like her story, were in good hands, safe with someone who would value them as much as she always had. While Mrs. Layla and Anna were secretly forming their alliance, Michael was growing increasingly anxious. He was certain that everything was going according to plan. For him, it was just a matter of time before he could get his hands on his grandmother's assets. With the diagnosis of dementia secured and his grandmother placed in a nursing home, Michael believed he had total control of the situation. One day, determined to push the plan forward, Michael decided to visit the family lawyer. He entered the office with an air of confidence, as if he was already in charge of everything. "Dr. Jones, I'm here to discuss my grandmother's documents. I believe that now, with her condition after being debilitated for so long, it's time to formalize the transfer of assets, Michael said, with a firm tone, masking the greed that truly drove him. The lawyer, experienced and well aware of the situation, kept a neutral expression as he listened to Michael. "Michael, I understand your concern, but there's something you need to know," Dr. Jones began, choosing his words carefully. Michael frowned, not understanding what the lawyer was implying. "What do you mean by that? Isn't the transfer a simple process after proving she has been in a nursing home and incapable for so long?" he asked, beginning to feel a slight unease. Dr. Jones took a deep breath before continuing. "It turns out that Mrs. Layla has already taken steps regarding her assets. She, completely lucid and within the law, transferred everything to someone else," the lawyer explained, closely watching Michael's reaction. Michael was stunned for a moment, unable to believe what he had just heard. What? What do you mean she transferred everything? To whom? This doesn't make sense. She was confused. She didn't know what she was doing, he protested, feeling anger rising within him. He couldn't understand how the plan had gotten out of control. The lawyer remained calm, but his voice was firm as he responded. "Michael, Mrs. Layla was fully aware of what she was doing. She made her choice clearly. The transfer was legal and there's nothing you can do to reverse it. I'm sorry, but you have no right to her assets," Dr. Jones stated, looking directly at Michael. Michael's expression quickly changed from disbelief to a simmering rage. He abruptly stood up, slamming his hands on the lawyer's desk. "This can't be happening. She's my grandmother. Everything should be mine. Who influenced her? Who took from me what is rightfully mine?" he shouted, feeling his world crumbling. Dr. Jones, unfazed, responded calmly. "Michael, what's done is irrevocable. You need to accept that your grandmother made her decision, and that decision is beyond your reach. Insisting on this will only make things worse for you," he advised, trying to bring some reason to Michael's troubled mind. But Michael, blinded by anger and frustration, didn't want to listen. He stormed out of the lawyer's office without looking back, feeling betrayed and humiliated. Now, more than ever, he was determined to find out who had interfered with his plans and to get revenge. But unaware that Anna was the one who had gained his grandmother's trust, Michael could only think about how his perfect plan had been destroyed and how everything seemed to be slipping from his grasp. Determined to understand what had really happened, Michael decided to return to the house. Upon arriving, he went straight to Mrs. Layla's office, where there was a computer with all the records of what had been going on. He searched through every email, every file, until he found something that made him stop. A document that revealed the truth he feared. All the assets had been transferred to Anna, the caregiver from the nursing home. Michael froze, feeling his blood boil. "So it was her, that woman," he muttered through clenched teeth, the hatred growing by the second. "She must have manipulated Grandma. How did I not see this before?" He stood up abruptly, knocking the computer to the floor. His breathing was heavy and his face was red with anger. With his mind racing, Michael began to recall conversations and moments when Anna seemed too close to Mrs. Layla. He had always thought she was just doing her job, but now he saw everything differently. "She got close to Grandma to steal everything from me. She must have taken advantage of her confusion to benefit herself," he thought, while trying to control the rage threatening to explode. In a desperate fit, Michael decided to investigate further. He knew his grandmother had something of great value hidden somewhere in the house. He had always suspected there was more than met the eye, especially when it came to the artwork his grandmother and grandfather loved and often talked about. Determined, he began to search for the hiding place he had always suspected existed. Michael scoured every corner of the house until he finally found a false wall in the basement, which seemed to be exactly what he was looking for. With effort, he opened the passage and, with his phone's flashlight, illuminated the interior. What he saw left him shocked. The hiding place was empty. He could hardly believe his eyes. "No, this can't be right. Where are the artworks? Where is everything?" he murmured, almost in a panic. The emptiness of the hiding place was a devastating blow. Michael fell to his knees on the cold floor, his mind spinning in search of an explanation. It was too late. Everything he believed to be his, all the fortune, the artworks, and his grandmother's legacy, was out of his reach. Michael tasted the bitter flavor of defeat. He had underestimated his grandmother, and above all Anna. Now he understood that Mrs. Layla, even under pressure, had found a way to protect what was hers. And Anna, that simple caregiver he never considered a threat, had become the guardian of everything he coveted. Overcome with frustration and hatred, Michael realized that no matter how hard he tried, there was nothing more he could do. The plan he had so carefully devised was completely ruined, and now he was alone with nothing but the bitterness of his own failure. Unable to control his anger and frustration, Michael decided he needed to confront Mrs. Layla. He was furious, feeling betrayed and humiliated, and he wanted answers. How could she trust everything to a caregiver and leave her own grandson with nothing? Without thinking twice, he went to the nursing home, determined to demand explanations. When he arrived at the nursing home, Michael wasted no time. He abruptly entered Mrs. Layla's room, his face red with fury. She was sitting calmly, reading a book, but looked up when she saw him enter like that. "Michael, what happened, my boy?" she asked, keeping her voice calm but knowing exactly what was coming. "You know very well what happened, Grandma. How could you do this to me? You transferred everything to that woman and left me with nothing. All of this was supposed to be mine, and you betrayed me," Michael shouted, not hiding the anger he felt. He paced back and forth like a caged animal as he unleashed his accusations. Mrs. Layla calmly closed the book, set it aside, and looked at her grandson with an expression that mixed sadness and firmness. "Michael, I know exactly what you tried to do. From the beginning, I saw your intentions. You made me take those pills, took me away from my home, all to make me seem incapable. But I wasn't blind, my grandson. I saw everything," she said, with a serenity that only years and experience could provide. Michael was paralyzed, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You knew? You knew and still did this?" "Why?" he asked, his voice now less firm, shaken by the revelation that his grandmother was aware of everything. "I knew, Michael, because I raised you. I know your heart, and I knew that greed was blinding you. That's why I made the decision to protect what is mine, to protect the legacy your grandfather and I built. You thought you could deceive me, but I was always one step ahead," Mrs. Layla explained, keeping her gaze fixed on her grandson without looking away. Michael, feeling defeated and humiliated, tried to appeal to her emotions. "But Grandma, I'm your grandson, your only family. How could you betray me like this? I've always been loyal to you," he said, his voice a mix of desperation and anger. Mrs. Layla shook her head, sad but resolute. "Michael, the true betrayal was yours. You tried to take from me what is mine, not out of need, but out of pure greed. I loved you and raised you like a son, but love can't justify what you did. That's why I had to act to protect what is right," she replied without raising her voice, but with a firmness that Michael couldn't contest. He, speechless and with his face contorted by frustration, realized that he had lost. There was nothing more he could do or say. His grandmother, the one he had underestimated, was calm and secure because she had always known the truth. Mrs. Layla, still with a serene voice, made one last attempt to reach her grandson's heart. "Michael, there's still time for you to change. Money and possessions aren't everything. You can still choose another path, a path of truth and love. But that choice has to be yours," she said, with a look full of compassion. Michael, however, couldn't respond. The fury and wounded pride prevented him from accepting those words. Without saying anything more, he left the room, leaving Mrs. Layla behind, once again alone, but now with the certainty that she had done what was right. After Michael stormed out of the nursing home in a fury, Mrs. Layla knew he wouldn't give up so easily. Deep down, she felt there would need to be one more conversation, a final confrontation, to settle everything once and for all. That moment came the following morning when Michael returned to the nursing home, even more determined and full of unanswered questions. This time he entered Mrs. Layla's room without knocking, but without the same fury as before. There was something different in his eyes, a mix of anger and a desperate search for understanding. "Grandma, I need to know. How did you manage to do this? How did you make sure I wouldn't have any rights?" He was frustrated, but the weight of defeat was beginning to press down on his shoulders. Mrs. Layla, who was sitting at the table in her room writing a letter, looked at her grandson with an expression that combined compassion and determination. She stood up slowly, walked to the window, and with her back to Michael, began to speak. "Michael, when I realized you were trying to manipulate me, I had to act quickly. I knew that if you continued in control, you would end up destroying everything your grandfather and I built with so much effort and sacrifice. I couldn't let that happen." Michael crossed his arms, impatiently waiting for the answer he needed. "But how, Grandma? How did you leave me with nothing? I was the rightful heir. You know that." He was confused, trying to understand how everything had slipped out of his control. Mrs. Layla turned to him, her eyes filled with a wisdom that Michael seemed never to have understood. "Michael, what you didn't know is that I always had a contingency plan. My trusted lawyer helped me make an irrevocable transfer of all my assets to someone I knew would care for everything with love and responsibility. And that person is not you," she said, in a calm but firm voice. Michael was stunned. "Irrevocable? What does that mean exactly?" He was beginning to grasp what he had lost, but still trying to find some hope. Mrs. Layla explained patiently. "It means that, legally, you can't do anything to reverse what's been done. I transferred everything to Anna, the caregiver, who was by my side when I needed it most. She is now responsible for all my assets, and you have no rights over them. I made this decision because I knew that if I left everything in your hands, the fate of our family would be ruined," she said, looking directly into Michael's eyes, who by this time was pale and speechless. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He was indeed empty-handed, without the inheritance, without control of the assets, without anything. "So it's over. Everything I did was for nothing," he murmured, more to himself than to his grandmother, the weight of defeat finally bearing down on his shoulders. Mrs. Layla took a step forward, with a mixture of sadness and hope in her gaze. "Yes, Michael, it's over. But this doesn't have to be the end for you. There's still time to change, to follow a different path. Money should never have been the reason for you to act like this. There are other things in life that are more important, things money can't buy." Michael, speechless, realized that what he had lost was much more than just material possessions. He had lost the trust and respect of the one person who had always loved him unconditionally. Not knowing what to do or say, he simply left the room, more lost than ever. Mrs. Layla, as she watched him leave, felt a twinge of sadness, but also the peace of someone who had done what was necessary. She knew she had protected the family legacy, and now all that was left was to hope that Michael would one day find the true value of the things that really mattered in life. That same afternoon, after the final confrontation with Michael, Mrs. Layla felt exhausted but at peace. She was sitting in her favorite chair in her room, looking out the window, when Anna entered, bringing a tray with tea and biscuits. Seeing the elderly woman's tired expression, Anna approached carefully. "Mrs. Layla, you look tired. Is everything okay?" she asked, placing the tray on the table beside her. Mrs. Layla smiled gently at Anna. "Oh, my dear, it's been a long day. But now I feel I can finally rest knowing everything is in the right place," she replied in a serene tone. Anna noticed there was something different in her eyes, a determination. Anna pulled up a chair and sat next to Mrs. Layla, taking her hand gently. "Mrs. Layla, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me. I confess that when you told me about the transfer, I was surprised, but now, seeing how things have unfolded, I realize how much this means. Maybe it's time for you to return home," Anna said, her voice choked with emotion. Mrs. Layla squeezed Anna's hand, looking at her with tenderness. "Anna, I chose you because I saw in you someone who cares, who is responsible, and who has a good heart. I knew I could trust you to take care of what I built over my lifetime. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only right one. You were the light in my darkest days, and now you are the guardian of what is most important to me," Mrs. Layla explained, feeling a deep gratitude for having found someone so special. Hannah felt tears well up in her eyes, but she held back, wanting to convey strength and confidence. "Mrs. Layla, I promise I will honor this trust. I will take care of you, your assets, your memories, and I will do everything with the same care and dedication that you have always shown. I will never forget what you've done for me, and I will ensure that this entire legacy is preserved, just as you would like," Anna promised, her voice firm but full of emotion. Mrs. Layla smiled, moved. "I know you will, Anna. That's why I trust you so much. I feel that what we've done is right, and that the future of what I've built is safe in your hands," she said, feeling a lightness in her heart that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Anna, still holding Mrs. Layla's hand, felt a deep sense of responsibility, but also immense joy at being able to give back, in some way, everything she had received from this very special lady. She knew she had a great mission ahead, but she was ready to face it with the same love and dedication she had always had for Mrs. Layla. The two sat there in silence for a few minutes, enjoying each other's company. It was a moment of peace, of mutual gratitude, and of certainty that despite all the challenges, everything had ended as it should. The next day, after the revealing conversation, Michael, still unable to accept the situation, decided to make one last attempt. He couldn't accept that he had lost everything, and he was willing to do anything to reverse his grandmother's decision. With his mind full of arguments and empty promises, he returned to the nursing home determined to make Mrs. Layla change her mind. Upon entering Mrs. Layla's room, Michael tried to adopt a calmer tone, almost pleading. "Grandma, I made a mistake, I know that, but I'm your grandson, your family. We can work this out another way. You don't have to do this to me. We can find a way to resolve everything together," he said, trying to sound sincere. But the desperation was evident in his voice. Mrs. Layla, who was sitting in her chair reading, looked up at her grandson, but her expression was firm, unyielding. "Michael, it's no use trying to convince me anymore. I've already made my decision, and that decision is final. Everything you've done only showed me that I made the right choice," she replied, her voice calm. Michael, realizing his words weren't having an effect, began to get agitated. "But Grandma, you don't understand. They tricked you. That caregiver just wants your money. She doesn't care about you like I do. We are family. That should mean something," he insisted, trying to appeal to their blood relationship. Mrs. Layla, remaining calm, shook her head slowly. "Michael, you're mistaken. Anna is the only one who has shown me true concern, who took care of me without expecting anything in return. You, on the other hand, were only interested in what I owned, not in who I am," she said with a firm voice but full of sadness for what her grandson had become. Frustrated and seeing that his words weren't having an effect, Michael let the mask of remorse fall. "You'll regret this, Grandma. When you realize you've lost everything, it'll be too late. I'm the only family you have, and you're throwing it all away for a stranger," he shouted, his voice full of anger and despair. Mrs. Layla stood up from her chair, facing her grandson with a firmness Michael had never seen before. "Michael, what I've lost is the grandson I thought I knew, the boy I raised with so much love. But what I gained by protecting my legacy and trusting Anna is the peace of knowing that everything will be okay, far from your greedy hands. I have nothing more to say to you. I want you to leave and not come back here, and don't return to my house either. Find your own place," she said in a voice that left no room for argument. Michael, shocked by his grandmother's firmness, stood still for a moment, not knowing how to react. "So that's it? You're throwing me out after everything?" he asked, his voice now full of disbelief. Mrs. Layla kept her gaze steady. "Yes, Michael. I'm giving you the chance to leave with some dignity. But know that from now on, you are no longer welcome in my family. My doors are closed to those who don't respect my wishes and can't appreciate what truly matters," she responded, turning to the window, ending the conversation. With nothing left to say, Michael realized he had lost for good. Feeling the weight of defeat, he left the room without looking back. Mrs. Layla, despite the pain of having to push her own grandson away, felt at peace. She knew she had done what was necessary to protect her legacy, and more importantly, her own dignity. Now she could finally rest, knowing she had done what was right, even if it meant cutting ties with someone she had once loved so much. As the days passed, life at the nursing home became increasingly peaceful for Mrs. Layla, but she knew her true place was in the home she loved so much. One day, while they were having tea in the garden, she turned to Anna with a serene smile. "Anna, I think it's time to go back home," she said with quiet determination in her voice. Anna, who had always known this moment would come, smiled back with a sparkle in her eyes. I knew you would say that at some point, Mrs. Layla, and I'm ready to help with anything you need. Let's pack your things and make this move happen, she replied warmly. In the following days, Anna took care of every detail to ensure Mrs. Layla's return home was as smooth as possible. She organized the move, contacted the service providers, and made sure everything was in perfect order for Mrs. Layla's arrival. When the day finally came, Mrs. Layla was radiant. Even with her advanced age, she felt a renewed energy at the thought of returning to the place where she had spent so many happy moments. Anna helped her into the van that would take them back home, holding her hand throughout the journey, while Mrs. Layla looked out the window, feeling her heart beat faster with every mile traveled. Upon arrival, Mrs. Layla was moved to see the house again. Everything was as she remembered, but now it seemed even more special. It's so good to be back. I feel like I'm returning to myself, she said, as Anna helped her out of the van. Anna smiled, proud to have helped Mrs. Layla fulfill this wish. This house has always been your home, Mrs. Layla. This is where you should be, surrounded by your memories and the peace you deserve, Anna said as they walked towards the entrance. Inside the house, every corner brought back a memory. Mrs. Layla walked through the rooms, touching the furniture and walls with affection as if she were greeting old friends. This place holds so many stories, and now I want to write the final chapters of my life here in peace, she said, sitting in her favorite chair, the same one where she had often sat with her late husband. Anna, always by her side, watched Mrs. Layla's quiet joy and felt a deep gratitude for being part of this moment. I'll be here with you every day to make sure you have everything you need. You'll be able to live your days just the way you've always wanted, Anna promised with a gentle smile. Mrs. Layla looked at Anna with eyes full of gratitude. I know I can count on you, Anna, and that's why I'm at peace. Now I'll live each day with tranquility, surrounded by what I love most, she said, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling completely at home. With Anna by her side, Mrs. Layla knew the days to come would be serene and happy. She was back in her home, where she had always belonged, and she was ready to live the rest of her life in peace, knowing that everything was in its rightful place. On a quiet morning, while they were having breakfast on the veranda, Anna decided it was the right moment to share some important news with Mrs. Layla. There was something she needed to tell her, something she had done with the utmost care and respect for her friend's memories and legacy. Anna, you seem thoughtful today, Mrs. Layla commented, noticing Anna's slight hesitation. Did something happen? Anna smiled, trying to hide her anxiety. Actually, Mrs. Layla, there's something I wanted to tell you. Something I did. Something I thought would be best for your precious artworks. Mrs. Layla looked up, intrigued. What is it, my dear? What did you do? Anna took a deep breath and gently held Mrs. Layla's hand before beginning to explain. I know how much those artworks mean to you and your husband, and I also know how important it was to keep them safe all these years. But with everything that happened, I thought a lot about what would be best for them and for you. Mrs. Layla leaned forward slightly, curious. And what did you decide? Anna, still holding her friend's hand, smiled. I took them out of the hiding place and put them in the safest museum in the country. There they are protected, cared for by experts, and most importantly, they have the place they deserve. Those works represent a part of your history, and now they will be safe, preserved forever. Mrs. Layla was silent for a moment, absorbing Anna's words. She could feel the weight of the decision Anna had made, and at the same time she felt immense gratitude. You did this to ensure they would be safe? She asked softly. Anna nodded with a calm smile. Yes, Mrs. Layla. I thought they deserved to be in a place where more people could appreciate them, where your story could be told through them, and whenever you want, we can visit them. They'll be there, intact, waiting for us, she said with a look full of affection. Mrs. Layla felt tears well up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy and gratitude. Anna, you thought of everything. I never would have imagined that they could be so well cared for and at the same time so accessible. This means so much to me, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Anna squeezed Mrs. Layla's hand gently. I just did what I thought was right, Mrs. Layla. Those artworks are part of who you are, and now they will be protected forever. And whenever you want to see them, I'll be right there with you, Anna promised with a smile. Mrs. Layla smiled back, feeling a deep peace in her heart. "Thank you, Anna. You did what I didn't even know needed to be done. Now those works are where they should always have been, and I am at peace with that," she said, as the two embraced, further strengthening the friendship and partnership that united them. With that, Mrs. Layla knew her legacy was not only protected but also honored, and that the artworks that had once been her great treasure now belonged to the world, preserved for future generations. And more importantly, she knew she had by her side a friend she could trust completely, who took care of everything with the same love and dedication that she herself had always shown. While Mrs. Layla and Anna found peace and happiness in the house that was now their true home, Michael, on the other hand, sank deeper into frustration and despair. Without access to his grandmother's fortune, he found himself completely lost, not knowing what to do or where to go. The doors he had thought would open with Mrs. Layla's wealth were now closed, and he began to feel the weight of the consequences of his choices. Michael tried to return to the life he had before attempting to seize his grandmother's assets, but nothing seemed to work. Friends who had once flattered him because of the money he expected to inherit now avoided him, realizing he had nothing left to offer. Without family support and with an uncertain future, he wandered the streets, lost in his own thoughts. Anger and frustration consumed him, but deep down, he knew it was all a result of his own actions. One day, while sitting on a park bench, staring into space, Michael realized how much he had lost. Not just the money and material possessions, but also the only family he truly had. The memory of Mrs. Layla, firm and resolute, refusing to give in, haunted him. He knew he had betrayed her trust, and for that he was paying the price. The life he had imagined for himself, surrounded by wealth and power, now seemed like a distant illusion, something he would never achieve. Meanwhile, in the house that had once been the stage for Michael's attempts to take everything, Mrs. Layla and Anna lived a peaceful and joyful routine. Laughter was frequent, and conversations flowed naturally, with Mrs. Layla becoming more and more cheerful and happy in her home. Anna was always nearby, ensuring that Mrs. Layla had everything she needed, and the two shared a friendship that transcended time and circumstance. Mrs. Layla rarely thought of Michael now. She had made peace with her decision to leave him behind, knowing that he needed to learn for himself the value of the things that really mattered. "He made his choice, and I made mine," she would say to Anna in a calm voice but without bitterness. "Now I need to take care of what's left of my life and enjoy every moment with those who truly care." Anna, always by Mrs. Layla's side, supported her in everything. "Mrs. Layla, you made the right decision, and whatever Michael's future may hold, he needs to understand the consequences of the choices he made," she would say, with a tone of understanding and affection. Time passed, and as Mrs. Layla and Anna moved forward, finding peace and happiness in each day they spent together, Michael remained on the sidelines, frustrated and alone, without the wealth he had so coveted, and without the love of the grandmother he had once betrayed. He knew there was no turning back, and all that remained now was to face the emptiness left by his own greed. The life he had imagined would never materialize, while Mrs. Layla and Anna lived a reality far richer than any fortune could provide. As time passed, life in Mrs. Layla's house became an example of peace and harmony. She and Anna found in their daily companionship a simple yet profound joy that neither of them had ever imagined. Each day was filled with small tasks, long conversations, and laughter that echoed through the rooms, bringing new energy to that home. One afternoon, while they were in the garden tending to the flowers, Mrs. Layla looked at Anna with an affectionate smile. "You know, Anna, I never thought I would find such a true friend like you, especially at this stage of my life. Life has its surprises, and you were the best one," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. Anna, who was pruning a rose bush, looked up and returned the smile. "Mrs. Layla, I'm the one who should be grateful. You showed me what trust is and gave me a greater purpose than I could have imagined. I feel privileged to be by your side, not just as a caregiver but as a friend," she replied, her voice full of emotion. Mrs. Layla, touched by Anna's words, reached out to hold her hand. "We are more than friends, Anna. We are partners, taking care of each other and building a home full of love. And that, my dear, is the true wealth," she said with a serene smile that reflected the peace she felt. The days continued to pass, and the friendship between the two only grew stronger. They took care of the house, the garden, and most importantly, each other. Every small achievement was celebrated, and every difficulty was faced with the certainty that together they could overcome anything. Sometimes when the sun began to set and the sky turned orange and pink, the two would sit on the porch, sharing stories and dreams. For Mrs. Layla, those moments were a reminder that, despite everything that had happened, she had found something much more valuable than any fortune. And Anna, in turn, felt that she had found a family. One night, as they prepared dinner together, Mrs. Layla paused for a moment and looked at Anna with a peaceful smile. "Anna, if someone asked me what the secret to a happy life is, I would say it's finding someone you can count on, someone who stands by you in good times and bad. And I found that in you," she said, her voice gentle but full of meaning. Anna, moved, looked at Mrs. Layla with eyes shining with gratitude. "And I found that in you, Mrs. Layla. Let's keep taking care of each other, living each day with love and loyalty. Because in the end, that's what matters most," she replied, feeling deeply connected to the woman who was now much more than just a friend. And so the story of Mrs. Layla and Anna ended in a simple but extraordinary way. They proved that true wealth is not in material possessions, but in the love, respect, and friendship they built. Together they moved forward, creating a world where care and loyalty were the most precious treasures, and at the end of each day they knew they had found something money could never buy, a true and unbreakable friendship. If you enjoyed this story, I humbly ask you to leave a comment and share what you learned. I would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like the video, and at the end, I'll leave some other emotional stories that I'm sure you'll love. Goodbye.